I'll tell you how it started, because almost no one gets that part right. The reports say she looked at me on the parade ground of Velorvith Station and went still. They say the Commander-Queen of the 7th Reach Fleet, the woman who had taken 4 border systems in 11 months without losing a single capital vessel, stood in the open air of her own review ground with 200 of her senior officers watching and could not, for 7 full seconds, make her face do what she wanted it to do. I was there. I can confirm every part of that. What the reports don't say is why. My name is Kalen Dross. I am 49 years old. I spent 23 years in the Union Forward Infantry, most of it in places the Union later declined to officially acknowledge, and I retired with a rank I was never supposed to reach and a body that still wakes me before dawn with memories it has no diplomatic interest in suppressing. I am not a large man. I am not a decorated man, not in any visible way. The decorations exist, but I stopped wearing them after the Second War because they drew conversation I didn't want to have. I have gray at my temples, a jaw that has been reset twice, hands that are not entirely steady in certain kinds of cold, and an apparently disconcerting stillness that a Union psychologist once described, in a formal assessment I found in my own file, as arresting vigilance that most subjects cannot place and find unsettling to be near. I thought that was an interesting thing to put in a file. I kept a copy. The treaty that brought me to Velorvith Station was the 7th Compact Addendum, Article 19, Subsection 4. The Veldrine Reach Authority had been engaged in a prolonged border negotiation with the Union Compact for 11 years. The final terms included, at the Union's insistence, a mutual assignment provision. One senior Veldrine officer would serve as an official liaison at Union Central Command, and one Union representative, a compact companion, the specific designation, would be assigned to the Veldrine's highest-ranking active military commander. The Veldrine had agreed to the provision because they assumed it would be a formality, a soft diplomat, a compact administrator, someone who would sit in a room and receive briefings and write summary reports and stay completely out of the way. The Union had agreed to it because the treaty negotiators were tired, and it seemed like a minor concession, and also because Compact Liaison Officer Hessatale had looked at my file, looked at the assignment brief, and made a decision that I suspect she found quietly amusing. I found out I was assigned 3 weeks before departure. I read the full brief twice. Then I packed one bag, which is the habit of someone who has spent a career moving quickly and has learned that everything beyond one bag is something you end up leaving behind anyway, and took the transport and sat in the forward compartment for 9 days reading everything I could find about the Veldrine Reach Authority, their military hierarchy, their command protocols, their border engagement records, and the specific career file of Commander Queen Orvithsal Ven of the 7th Reach Fleet. I also read the complete text of the 7th Compact Addendum and all 19 of its supplementary annexes, the Casavar 1987 Agreement and its 2003 Amendment, the Bilateral Transit Supplement of 2039, and everything I could locate in the publicly accessible Compact Archive relating to any active dispute in the Veldrine Outer Reach. By the 6th day, I had filled 2 reader tablets with cross-reference notes and had begun to suspect that the treaty architecture, while extensive, had been assembled by people who had not always been talking to each other. By the 8th day, I was certain of it. By the 9th day, I had found 31 pathways through the architecture that I did not believe the Veldrine legal staff was aware existed. I did not know yet whether any of them would be useful. I noted them anyway. That is the work. You find the edges before you need them, or you find them when it is already too late. That file was the most interesting document I read in the entire 9 days. The Veldrine are not a species that practices subtlety about power. Their skin is the deep navy blue of deep space, with bioluminescent markings that run along the neck and jaw and forearms in patterns determined by bloodline and rank. Their eyes are compound, silver-black, built for tactical assessment at distances that make humans reach for instruments. Commander Queens are the apex designation in their military structure, not a ceremonial title, not a political appointment, but the result of surviving a selection process that begins at age 12 and ends, for the very few who complete it, at a rank assessment they call the Velorvith, the standing. Orvith Sol Ven had passed the Velorvith at 27. She had taken the 7th Reach Command at 31. She was 43 when the treaty assigned me to her fleet. Her file contained 78 engagements, a casualty rate among her own forces that was less than a third of the Reach Authority average, a personal combat assessment that the Veldrine Military Archive had marked with a notation I had to look up Velsol, which roughly translates as not to be engaged at close quarters under any classification of circumstances. She had 4 citations for actions during the Kassavar border incursion that I read carefully and did not put down for a long time. She was, by any measure I knew how to apply, exceptional. The transport arrived at Velorvith Station on the 41st day of the Union Standard Calendar Year. I came down the ramp with my bag over one shoulder and my compact liaison documentation in my left chest pocket, and found myself standing on a Veldrine military review ground in the particular kind of morning light that high-altitude orbital platforms produce, thin, directionless, slightly cold. There were 200 officers in formation on that ground. Their armor was the deep burgundy red of Veldrine 7th Reach Command, trimmed in silver, every rank marking in precise alignment. They stood with the particular stillness of people who have stood in formation 10,000 times and have learned to be absolutely motionless without being absent. The review ground itself was a wide, flat expanse of orbital plate composite, the surface worn smooth by decades of boots at parade rest. At its far edge, the station's outer viewport offered a view of the contested reach below. 3 disputed waypoint markers visible as soft orange lights against the stardark, close enough to be permanent reminders of what the 7th Reach Fleet existed to protect. Commander Queen Orvith Sol Ven stood at the head of the formation. I had seen her file photo. I had read her assessments. None of it had prepared me for the specific quality of her presence in 3-dimensional space, which was the presence of someone who had been, for a very long time, the most dangerous person in every room she entered, and had never found a reason to pretend otherwise. She was in full command dress. The rank markings on her neck and jaw were a deep gold-silver, the highest tier of bioluminescent rank in the Reach Authority, and they caught the thin station light in a way that made them visible from a distance that I thought was probably intentional. Her compound eyes were doing what compound eyes do when their owner is conducting a tactical assessment, which is to say they were processing everything in front of them simultaneously without visibly focusing on any of it. She was looking at me. The specific way she was looking at me is something I have thought about since, because I have spent enough time in proximity to people who have assessed incoming threats for a living to know what that look means. It is not fear in the civilian sense. Fear in the civilian sense is the anticipation of harm and the desire to avoid it. What the Commander Queen's compound eyes were doing when they found me was something more specific than that. She recognized me. Not personally. We had never met. What she recognized was a category, and the recognition had caught her without warning, and for 7 full seconds she stood in front of 200 of her senior officers and could not make her face settle back to the expression it had been wearing before I came down that ramp. I understood later what she had seen. I did not understand it then. Then I simply walked across the review ground and stopped the appropriate protocol distance from her and said, in my best approximation of Veldrine formal register, that I was Compact Liaison Dross, assigned per Article 19 subsection 4, and that I was at her disposal. She looked at me for another 2 seconds. Around us, the formation held its perfect stillness, 200 compound-eyed officers maintaining parade posture, while something that was not in the morning's program occurred between their commander Queen and the human who had walked off the transport. Then she said, in precise compact standard without inflection, "You were at Threshold Station." I said I was. She said nothing else. She turned to her officers and completed the review. She did not look at me again for 40 minutes. I stood where I had been told to stand and watched a Veldrine command formation, and thought about the fact that she had known. The Threshold Station engagement was 12 years old, and had been officially unacknowledged by the Union for 9 of those 12 years, and had appeared in exactly 3 documents I had ever been able to find in any public archive, none of which named individual personnel. The Commander Queen of the 7th Reach Fleet had looked at me for 7 seconds and placed me at an engagement that had not officially happened. That was the first time I understood that the next year was going to be interesting. The formal assignment brief described my role as advisory and observational. I was to attend fleet briefings, provide Union compact perspective on treaty matters, prepare monthly summary reports for liaison officer tail, and maintain appropriate protocol distance from operational military decisions. I was not, under any interpretation of the compact's guidelines, a participant. The first briefing I attended was on the 3rd day, in the Commander Queen's primary strategy room, which occupied the forward section of the command vessel Orvithsal, and was designed to hold 40 officers in standing consultation positions around a table that was itself a 3-dimensional tactical display. The table showed the Cassivar Reach in real-time resolution, every disputed waypoint, every transit corridor, every pending certification boundary rendered in pale blue light. It was a tool of genuine sophistication, and the officers who surrounded it used it with the casual ease of people who had been reading that particular display for years. I arrived 3 minutes before the briefing was scheduled to begin, found a position at the back of the room, and stood there with my compact reader in my hand and my mouth shut. The briefing concerned a Veldrine border situation in the Cassivar Outer Reach, a collection of contested waypoints where 3 different compact signatories had overlapping claims, and a 4th had been making incremental moves that the Veldrine described as encroachment, and the 4th party described as routine transit operations. Commander Queen then walked through the situation with the kind of precision that made it clear she had memorized every waypoint designation, every transit log, every filed claim and counterclaim, and the specific legal language of 6 different compact agreements. At one point, one of her senior officers, a fleet rank commander named Velsorn Reith, who had a scar across his jaw that matched a combat engagement I had read about in the Veldrine Open Archive, made a proposal regarding a preemptive positioning maneuver that the Commander Queen considered for approximately 4 seconds, and then declined, citing the specific compact clause that would have transformed the maneuver from positioning to incursion under the treaty's definition matrix. I noted the clause number. It was correct. It was also not the only relevant clause. I did not say anything. It was my 3rd day. I stood at the back of the room and read my compact reader and kept my assessment internal. This continued for 11 days. I attended the briefings. I read the documents. I built a working map in my own notes of the treaty architecture as it applied to every active Veldrine position in the Cassivar Reach. The map was not simple. The treaty architecture was the product of 11 years of negotiation between parties that had, at various points in those 11 years, had different priorities and different lead negotiators and different definitions of identical terms, which meant that the resulting document set contained a number of internal contradictions, a number of obsolete provisions that remained technically in force, and a number of pathways that had probably existed by accident rather than design, and that no one seemed to have noticed. I found 31 pathways in the first 11 days. I did not mention any of them. This is a habit from a different kind of work. When you are new to a position, any position, whether the position is a briefing room or a defended corridor, you watch before you act. You learn the rhythms. You find out who reports to whom, who defers to whom in practice regardless of formal hierarchy, which problems are considered solved that are not actually solved, and which problems are considered urgent that are not actually urgent. You find the edges of the room before you decide where to stand. The strategy briefings gave me the rhythm of the 7th Reach Fleet's command culture. The Veldrine operate with a formality that is not ceremony. It is the product of a species whose bioluminescent markings are visible indicators of internal state, which means that in a room full of Veldrine officers, everyone can see when someone is uncertain or elevated or calculating. The formal protocols exist partly to provide a structure within which those visible states have context. I was the only person in those briefing rooms whose internal state was invisible to everyone else present. I noted this. I thought it was probably a significant asymmetry, and that it was worth allowing it to accumulate before I spent it. On the 12th day, Velsorn Reith made another proposal. This one concerned a transit authorization that the Commander-Queen had been attempting to file with the Compact Registry for 6 weeks without resolution. The registry processing had stalled at a subcommittee level that was itself a function of a jurisdictional overlap in the treaty language. Velsorn Reith's proposal was to route the authorization through a secondary channel that would bypass the subcommittee. The Commander-Queen considered this for 6 seconds, which was longer than she usually considered proposals from her officers, and I took that as a sign that she had already found the same problem I was looking at, which was that the secondary channel he had proposed had been closed under a 2041 addendum that most of the Compact Treaty practitioners I knew were not aware of because it had been filed under a miscategorized heading in the registry index. I said, "That channel won't work." Every compound eye in the room turned to face me. I said, "The 2041 addendum to the Cassivar transit provisions reclassified secondary channel authorization routes as primary channel substitutes under Article 7. Using it for the transit filing would trigger the same subcommittee review. There's a tertiary pathway through the Article 12 bilateral review mechanism that's still classified as advisory, not binding. It can be used for transit authorizations under a specific word count in the filing, 47 words. The Compact Registry clears it in 4 days rather than 6 weeks. There was a silence in the strategy room that had a specific quality to it, which was the silence of 40 Veldrine command officers recalibrating. Commander-Queen, Ven, looked at me from across the strategy table. Her compound eyes were doing the assessment thing again. The bioluminescent rank marks at her jaw had brightened very slightly, which I had already learned was a Veldrine physiological response to a situation requiring elevated attention. The gold-silver of her markings was fractionally more gold. She said, "You read the 2041 addendum." I said I had read everything I could find about the Cassivar transit provisions on the 9-day transport. She said, "File the authorization through the Article 12 pathway. Use the 47 words." The authorization cleared in 3 days. After that, I was asked to the strategy briefings as a matter of course, which had not been part of the original assignment. I continued to stand at the back of the room. I continued to speak only when I had something specific to offer. I began, methodically, to work through the Compact Treaty Archive as it related to every ongoing Veldrine border situation, making notes in a system of my own devising that I would not have been able to explain to anyone else, but that allowed me to find things quickly when they were needed. I had been doing this for 23 years in different contexts. The treaty archive was not so different from a combat situation map. It was all a matter of knowing where the edges were. You read from the beginning. You marked the boundaries. You found the places where the terrain was ambiguous, where the map said one thing and the ground said another, where the passage that looked impassable turned out to have a seam if you stood at the right angle and looked long enough. I had found seams in environments where the cost of being wrong about them was measured in lives. The compact archive was kinder. The cost of being wrong was measured in weeks. Commander Queen Ven did not speak to me informally for the first 3 weeks. Her officers watched me with a range of expressions that could be broadly described as skeptical, ranging from Velsorn Reith's open calculation. He had revised his assessment of me at some point after the transit authorization, and was now looking at me the way a person looks at something they are not sure is a weapon or a tool. To a junior tactical officer named Orvithsal Marin, who had apparently decided I was neither dangerous nor relevant, and treated me with the polite neutrality one extends to furniture. I did not find this troubling. I had been the new person in operational environments many times. The calculation took as long as it took. The thing you could not do was hurry it. What happened at the end of the 3rd week was not related to treaty architecture. On the 22nd day, the 7th Reach Fleet received a signal from a Union transport that had strayed into the outer reach of the contested Kassavar waypoints during a navigation error, and was now being held by the fourth-party faction, the one engaged in what it called routine transit operations, on grounds of unauthorized entry into disputed transit space. The transport carried 43 passengers, 11 of whom were Union compact civilian staff. The faction holding them was called the Velorvath Advancement Consolidation, and the Commander Queen's file on them, which I had read, described them as an entity that operated at the edges of compact treaty legitimacy and had a specific history of using detained transports as bargaining instruments in prolonged jurisdictional negotiations. They were not violent in an obvious sense. They were patient in the particular way of organizations that have learned that patience, properly applied, is more effective than force. The strategy room assembled in 12 minutes. Commander Queen Ven stood at the head of the table. She laid out 3 options. The options were militarily sound and politically calibrated, and each of them had a resolution timeline of between 3 and 6 weeks. I waited until she finished. Then I said, "There's a 4th option." She looked at me. I said, "The Velorvath Advancement Consolidation holds a provisional transit certification under the Kassavar 1987 Compact Agreement, Article 3. That certification requires annual renewal. They filed the most recent renewal on the 15th of last month. I checked the registry this morning. The renewal was processed by the same subcommittee that's been holding the Commander Queen's transit authorization for 6 weeks. The subcommittee is behind. The renewal is unprocessed. Under Article 3, Subsection 9, a transit certification that is unprocessed after 30 days of filing automatically lapses into provisional status, which means the Velorvath Consolidation currently has no valid transit authorization for the outer Kassavar waypoints. Their seizure of the Union transport is therefore conducted without treaty cover. They know this. They are almost certainly going to receive a legal notice from the Compact Registry in approximately 11 days when the subcommittee catches up. If we file an Article 7 bilateral review request citing the lapsed certification today, we can accelerate that notice to 48 hours, at which point the consolidation has to release the transport or lose its provisional status permanently. The silence in the strategy room was a different quality this time. It was not recalibration. It was something closer to the specific stillness that occurs in a room when everyone in it is simultaneously understanding something they had not understood before. The tactical display between us rendered the outer waypoints in pale blue, the detained transport a pulsing amber dot among them, and for a moment no one moved. Commander Queen Ven stood at the head of the table and looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "File it." The transport was released in 41 hours. After that, I was given an office. It was a small room adjacent to the strategy deck, which I suspected had previously been a storage space. But it had a desk and a reader terminal and direct access to the compact treaty archive. And I sat in it for most of the next 6 weeks and built the most complete map of the Veldrine border situations treaty architecture that I believed had ever been assembled by a single person. I brought findings to strategy briefings. I answered questions from officers who began, gradually, to route administrative problems through my office before taking them to the Commander-Queen. Velsorn Reith, who had been the most skeptical of the initial skeptics, came to see me on the 38th day with a question about the Consolidation's pending appeal of the Article 7 review, sat in my office for 2 hours, and left with an expression I had seen before on the faces of people who have revised an assessment significantly. He did not say anything complimentary. He did not need to. The expression was sufficient. The Commander-Queen came to my office once on the 41st day. She stood in the doorway. She had 3 questions about the appeal timeline. I answered them. She asked a 4th question which was not about the appeal. She asked what I knew about the Veldrine forward engagement at a specific location in the Kassavar Reach that had not appeared in any document I had access to. I told her what I knew, which was almost nothing. She said, "You were briefed at Threshold Station on operations that your government has not acknowledged." I said that some of what I knew from that period could not be confirmed from accessible sources. She said, "I am asking what you know, not what can be confirmed." I told her. It took about 15 minutes. She listened without expression and did not ask follow-up questions. When I finished, she said, "The assessment was correct in its broad lines and incorrect in one specific respect. The entity you were told was operating independently was not. It was a Veldrine Reach Authority proxy." I sat with that for a moment. I said, "That's useful to know." She said, "I thought you would find it so." She paused. "The operation at Threshold Station cost you something." I said it had cost several things. She looked at me with her compound eyes doing the assessment work that they always did and said, "You are not what I was told you were." I asked what she had been told. She said, "A civilian diplomatic attachment, soft, administrative, suitable for the role as defined by the treaty's intent, which was to demonstrate the Union's commitment to the compact without providing the assigned liaison with any meaningful operational access." I said that was a reasonable description of how the assignment was structured. She said, "It is not a reasonable description of you." I did not say anything to that. She left without further comment, but she stood in the doorway for a moment before going, looking at the map I had built on my reader, the full treaty architecture of the Kassavar Reach, every provision and pathway and edge, rendered in my own notation system, and her compound eyes were still for 3 full seconds before she turned and walked away. I noted the stillness. I had come to understand that it was significant when her eyes went still. The situation that produced the event the reports focused on happened on the 67th day. A Veldrine fleet faction, not the Consolidation, a different entity called the Orvithsal Independent Reach, which is a designation that translates roughly as the reach that answers to no one, and which operated out of the outer border systems with a legal status that was, to put it precisely, ambiguous, had been filing a series of objections with the Compact Authority regarding the Commander-Queen's presence in the contested waypoints. The objections were framed as treaty challenges, but their actual function, which anyone who had read the underlying filings carefully could see, was to undermine her command authority by questioning the legal basis of the 7th Reach Fleet's deployment in the region. The Independent Reach was doing this because one of its primary interests was the same transit certification that had been central to the Consolidation standoff, and the Commander-Queen's successful use of the Article 7 review had set a precedent they found inconvenient. They wanted her out of the region. The way to get a Veldrine Commander-Queen out of a region, short of defeating her militarily, was to challenge the treaty foundation of her deployment. The challenge they had filed on the 61st day was technically sophisticated. It cited 4 compact articles and 2 bilateral agreements, and a jurisdictional precedent from a 1994 dispute that I had to spend 2 days tracking down in the archive subsystem before I found the original filing. The challenge argued that the Commander Queen's deployment constituted an unauthorized occupation of disputed transit space under the definition matrix of the 1987 agreement, and that her continued presence required a new authorization from the full Compact Subcommittee, rather than the operational deployment order she had been issued. If the challenge succeeded, the Commander Queen would be required to pull the 7th Reach Fleet from the region pending a subcommittee review that would take, given the subcommittee's current processing rate, approximately 4 months. In 4 months, the consolidation would have rebuilt its transit certification. The independent reach would have consolidated its own position. The work of the last 67 days would be substantially undone. I read the challenge filing 3 times. Then I read the 1994 precedent twice. Then I sat in my storage room office for 2 hours and worked through the response, because the response was not simple. It required establishing that the Commander Queen's deployment order had been issued under a different article than the one the challenge cited, and that the jurisdictional definition matrix the challenge relied on had been superseded by a 2003 amendment that the independent reach's legal team had apparently not found, and that the 1994 precedent, when read in full rather than in the excerpt the challenge had quoted, actually supported the Commander Queen's position rather than the challenger's. I brought the response brief to the strategy room on the 67th morning. The Commander Queen read it standing at her position at the head of the table. She read it twice. The second time she read it more slowly, and at one point she stopped and looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her face before, which was an expression I did not entirely know how to classify. It was not the assessment expression. It was something closer to recognition. The specific kind of recognition that occurs when a person finds a thing done exactly as it needed to be done, without excess and without deficiency. She filed the response that afternoon. The Compact Subcommittee rejected the challenge in 9 days. On the afternoon of the 67th day, 3 hours after the Commander Queen filed the response, the independent reach's acting senior commander, a man named Velorvith San, who had apparently decided that legal challenges were insufficient, sent a message to the Commander Queen's command vessel. The message was a formal Veldrine request for clarification of the treaty companion's status. The specific question it asked was whether the human compact liaison was operating as an official military advisor to the 7th Reach Fleet, because if he was, his presence in the strategy briefings and his involvement in compact treaty filings on behalf of the fleet would constitute a violation of Article 19's prohibition on foreign nationals in operational advisory roles. It was a careful message. It had been written by someone who understood treaty language. The challenge it presented was not easily dismissed, because Article 19 was ambiguous on the definition of advisory role, and the independent reach was betting that the ambiguity could be exploited to create either a compliance problem for the Commander Queen or a public conflict between her and her assigned compact liaison that would damage both the treaty relationship and her command position. I read the message when it was forwarded to me. I thought about it for a while. Then I went to the Commander Queen's office and knocked. She said, "Come in." I came in. I stood across the desk from her. She said, "You read the message." I said I had. She said, "The independent reach is attempting to use your presence here as a lever. If I distance you from operational matters, the treaty challenge response I filed today is called into question. If I acknowledge your involvement in the response, I may be in violation of Article 19. I said, "There is a third reading." She looked at me. I said, Article 19 prohibits foreign nationals in operational advisory roles. The treaty defines an operational advisory role as direct involvement in decisions of a military nature. The work I have done has been treaty interpretation and compact registry filing. None of it constitutes a decision of a military nature. The Commander-Queen made all military decisions. I identified legal pathways. That is the function of a compact liaison under subsection 4 of Article 19 itself, the same article the Independent Reach is citing, which specifically describes the liaison's role as facilitating treaty compliance and compact registry navigation. I have been exactly what the article says I am supposed to be. The Independent Reach is misreading the article it cited to challenge me. She sat with this. I said, the response to their message is to cite subsection 4 back at them. 14 words. Anything more is unnecessary. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, 14 words. I said, compact liaison function is explicitly defined. The challenge cites the definition without reading the definition. She said, why did you find that in 9 days and they did not find it in 67? I said I had started reading from subsection 4 because it was the subsection that applied to me, and that I had then read the rest of the article because that was how I read documents. She said, how do you read documents? I said, start at the beginning, read every word, find the edges. She was quiet. Her compound eyes were still. This was unusual. The Commander-Queen's compound eyes were almost never still when she was thinking. The Veldrine process information visually in a way that produces small, constant movements at the margins. When her eyes went still, it meant she had stopped processing and was doing something else. I waited. She said, I knew at Threshold Station. I said, I know. She said, your file, your actual file, not the diplomatic summary. Liaison Officer Tail sent me the summary. I found the actual file 3 days before you arrived. A pause. I did not know what to do with it. I said that was a reasonable response to the file. She said, the engagement at Threshold Station, 14 hours, 7 Union infantry, 43 Veldrine proxy force personnel. She stopped. You were the one who held the corridor. I said I was one of 7 people who held the corridor. She said, the report I found does not describe it as a collective effort. I did not say anything to that. She said, I was not afraid of you on the parade ground. I said, I know. She said, I did not know what category to place you in. I have a system. Every person I have ever encountered can be placed in a category. My system has 47 categories. You did not fit any of them. That is the only time that has happened. I said, I'm sorry if that was uncomfortable. She said, it was not uncomfortable. It was, I did not have a word for it. There was a silence that was not a difficult silence. It was the silence of a room where 2 people have, without planning to, arrived at a more honest position than either of them had entered with. Outside the office viewport, the Cassavar Reach's waypoint markers pulsed their steady orange in the dark. The 3 lights that had been the center of 11 years of contention, still there, still patient, indifferent to the conversations happening within range of their glow. I said, the 14-word response to the Independent Reach will close the legal challenge. The subcommittee will reject it in 4 days. She said, I know. I said, after that, the next situation in the Cassavar Outer Reach will be the Velsorn Trade Corridor Authorization, which has been pending for 6 months, and which has a resolution pathway through the 2039 bilateral supplement if the Commander-Queen is willing to accept a 6-month provisional term in exchange for a permanent filing. She said, I read the 2039 supplement. It requires a co-authorization from a senior Union Compact official. I said, I am a senior Union Compact official. She was quiet for a moment. She said, you are a compact liaison attachment. I said, with full compact authorization authority under subsection 7. Liaison officer tale included the authority documents in my assignment brief. I have been carrying the authorization since I boarded the transport. The silence that followed was longer. She said very quietly, "You have had full compact authorization authority for 67 days. I said, "Yes." She said, "And you did not use it." I said, "I found the pathways that didn't require it. Full compact authority is a significant instrument. You use it when nothing else works." She looked at me. I said, "I didn't want to be the union's heavy hand. I wanted to find the solutions that held on their own without the weight of the authority behind them. Those are more durable." She said nothing for a while. The waypoint lights pulsed outside. Then she said, "Velorvith." I had not heard that word spoken to a person before. I had read it in the Veldrine Military Archive, in the section on command honors. It is not a compliment in the conventional sense. It is a specific designation, used within Veldrine command culture, that means approximately the one who knows the shape of the field before the field has declared itself. It is given to strategists, to commanders who understand terrain before they walk it, to people whose judgment has proven accurate in conditions where accuracy is not guaranteed. It is the Commander Queen's highest recognition. I said, "I don't think I've earned that." She said, "You held a corridor for 14 hours. I said, "That was a long time ago." She said, "You found 47 treaty pathways in 67 days. I said, "The archive is well organized once you know where to look." She said, "You declined to use an authority you had been carrying since the first day." I said, "That seemed like the right call." She said, "Yes," a pause. "It was the right call. I would have found that authority in the morning." I said I assumed she would have. She said, "And you still didn't use it." I said I had not needed to. She looked at me for a long time with her compound eyes still, the way they went still when she had stopped processing. The bioluminescent marks at her jaw had shifted again, not brighter, exactly, but steadier, the way a light source stops flickering when it finds its settled state. Then she said, "The Veldrine do not have a category for this either. We have Velorvith, we have Sail Velorvith, we have the standing acknowledgement, but none of those are exactly what you are." I said I didn't need to be a category. She said, "No, I don't think you do." The event that the galaxy knows about happened 3 weeks later. The independent reach, having lost 2 legal challenges and its provisional transit certification, escalated. The escalation was not legal. On the 89th day, 2 independent reach vessels entered the outer Cassivar waypoints without authorization and took up positions that the Commander Queen's tactical officers described, with the specific technical precision that Veldrine command culture produces, as a provocation that does not meet the threshold for military response, but is designed to require one. The Commander Queen called a full command briefing, all senior officers of the 7th Reach Fleet, the command vessel's primary briefing chamber, which was a large room which was full. I was in my office when the briefing was called. I was not senior fleet personnel. I was not on the briefing roster. Velsorn Reith came to my office. He stood in the doorway. He said, "The Commander Queen wants you in the briefing." I put down my reader and went. I stood at the back of the briefing chamber, in the position I always took, and listened while the Commander Queen laid out the situation. 2 vessels, unauthorized positioning, below the threshold for a compact-sanctioned military response. The independent reach was betting that the Commander Queen could not respond without violating the treaty, could not ignore them without losing the contested waypoints, and could not resolve it through legal channels, because the escalation was designed to move faster than legal channels operated. She finished laying out the situation. She asked for options. Her officers gave her options. The options were good. They were also, each of them, either below what the situation required or above what the treaty allowed. I said, there is a compact provision for exactly this situation. Everyone in the room turned. I said, Article 11, subsection 3, unauthorized positioning in contested transit space, where the positioning is below the threshold for military response, but constitutes a material interference with authorized transit operations, can be addressed through a direct compact authority order requiring the unauthorized vessels to vacate. The order carries treaty weight. Noncompliance triggers automatic review of the positioning party's transit certification for the entire compact region. It is not a military action. It is a compact administrative directive. The Commander-Queen cannot file it, I can. My compact authorization authority under subsection 7 is sufficient. The briefing chamber was very quiet. The Commander-Queen looked at me from the head of the room. I said, it takes 11 minutes to prepare. It clears through the registry in 3 hours. The independent reach vessels will have to comply or lose their transit status for the entire Cassivar reach for a minimum of 2 years. She said, file it. I said, I'll need to be on record as filing on behalf of the 7th Reach Fleet under Article 19, subsection 4. That makes the Commander-Queen the authorizing officer of record. She said, I authorize it. I filed it from my compact terminal in the briefing chamber, with the full command staff of the 7th Reach Fleet watching. 11 minutes and 20 seconds. The registry confirmation came through in 2 hours and 51 minutes, which was 9 minutes faster than I had estimated, which I mention only because the Commander-Queen noted it, and I did not have a good explanation for the discrepancy. The independent reach vessel vacated in 2 hours and 40 minutes. After that, the reports say, the Commander-Queen of the 7th Reach Fleet called the full command staff to the primary briefing chamber, and before the assembled officers of the 7th Reach Fleet, spoke the Veldrine Command Acknowledgement Sail Velorvith. The reports are correct about that. What they do not fully convey is the specific weight of what that acknowledgement means, which is not simply a compliment or an award. Sail Velorvith is the Veldrine commander's recognition of a person as someone who stands in the field with them, who belongs in the standing, as they say, who has earned the right to be acknowledged as the Commander-Queen's equal in the specific sense that their presence changes the shape of what is possible. It has been spoken 31 times in the recorded history of the Veldrine Reach Authority. It is never spoken publicly in front of a command staff, without the intent to log it permanently in the compact authority record. She spoke it in Veldrine first and then in compact standard, which was also unusual. The acknowledgement is traditionally given only in Veldrine, as a language that does not compress or simplify the word. The translation she chose was precise and considered, and had clearly been prepared in advance. She spoke it without ceremony and without particular inflection, the way you speak a thing you mean completely and do not need to perform. The room was still for 3 seconds after she finished. The record was logged. The compact registry processed it in 4 days. The Galaxy, as the reports say, learned what it meant. What the Galaxy learned was not quite what the reports say they learned. The reports frame it as a revelation. The human who had paralyzed the Commander-Queen, the soft diplomatic attachment who turned out to be something else. That framing is not wrong, but it misses the part that I think about. She was not paralyzed by my past. She was paralyzed, if that is the right word, and I have thought about whether it is, by her own system failing. She had 47 categories. She had assessed every person she had ever encountered and placed them cleanly. She had not been surprised, in the specific sense of finding a data point she could not place, since she was 27 years old. I was not exceptional in the ways the reports suggest. I was not the man from Threshold Station. I was not the treaty expert. I was not the compact authority officer with the heavy instrument in his pocket that he chose not to use. I was someone who read the documents from the beginning and found the edges and waited for the moment when the edges were needed. That is a skill. It is not a glamorous skill. It is not the skill that makes good stories, generally. But I had practiced it for 23 years in places that required it, and I was, when I arrived at Velorvith Station, very good at it. The Commander Queen had been doing a version of the same thing for 16 years. That is what she recognized, standing on the parade ground in that thin, directionless station light. Not the danger, not the threshold station file, not the compact authority she didn't yet know about. She recognized someone who was doing what she was doing. That was the thing she didn't have a category for. I have been at Velorvith Station for 14 months now. My assignment was for 1 year. I requested an extension, citing ongoing treaty matters. Liaison Officer Tail approved it with a tone in her written response that I believe was still amused. The 7th Reach Fleet's position in the Kassavar Outer Reach is stable. The Independent Reach filed a compliance appeal that was rejected in 11 days. The Consolidation's transit certification lapsed permanently. The Trade Corridor authorization came through on provisional terms in the 87th day and will become permanent next spring if the filing holds. My office has a window now. It used to be the storage room. Velsorn Reith moved me to a proper office on day 91, he said, with the specific dry precision that I had come to understand was his version of warmth, that the storage room was beneath the dignity of the record. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. The Commander Queen and I have a standing consultation at the 7th hour of each morning. We go through the current treaty matters. She tells me what the military situation requires. I tell her what the legal architecture allows. We find the intersection. It takes between 45 minutes and 3 hours, depending on the week. On the long mornings, her tactical officer Orvith Sal Marin, who long ago stopped treating me as furniture, brings a tray with 2 cups of something warm that is neither Union coffee nor Veldrine standard ration, but something approximating a compromise between them, which I have found I look forward to. On the 1st of last month, the Commander Queen asked me, at the end of a consultation, whether I intended to return to the Union when my extended assignment concluded. I said I hadn't decided. She said, the treaty allows for a permanent compact liaison assignment at the request of the senior Veldrine commander. I said I was aware of that provision. She said, I'm aware that you are aware of it. I said, is the Commander Queen requesting a permanent assignment? She looked at me with her compound eyes doing the still thing. She said, the Commander Queen is noting the existence of the provision. I said, I'll read it carefully. She said, you will read it from the beginning and find the edges. I said, that is how I read documents. She said, yes, and then after a pause, it is also how you read everything else. I said I thought that was probably true. She was quiet for a moment longer. Outside the window of the consultation room, the 3 waypoint markers of the Kassavar Reach pulsed their steady orange, the same lights I had first seen on the day I arrived, the same lights I had been reading around for 14 months. They had not changed. The compact's position on each of them was better defined now, better defended, more durably held. The Commander Queen stood. The morning consultation was over. At the door she paused, the way she had paused in the doorway of my storage room office on the 41st day to look at the map I had built. She said, read the provision. I said I would. She said, the edges are favorable. Then she left. I sat in the morning light from my window, which is the thin, directionless, slightly cold light of a high-altitude orbital platform, and which I have come to find over 14 months not uncomfortable at all. I opened the treaty archive. I found Article 19, subsection 12, the permanent assignment provision. I read it from the beginning. She was right about the edges. The compact registry has the acknowledgement on permanent record. The treaty is stable. The outer reach is held. I am not planning to leave.